Welcome to the Steelers Breakdown Podcast. He's PennLive's Steelers beat reporter Nick Farabaugh, and I'm John Luciew. And this is a special edition with Nick coming to us from the NFL Combine, the player evaluation event that some have dubbed the Underwear Olympics. And it's where Steelers GM Omar Khan addressed the gaggle of Pittsburgh press assembled there earlier today and got into some choice comments about George Pickens, about the quarterback situation, and where he thinks the talent is deepest in the draft. All this as it's about to get real. The work of rebuilding this Steelers roster for 2025 is about to get underway. You know, we're going to have the evaluations at the combine, followed close on the heels by the start of free agency, and then, of course, the draft coming up after that. And Nick is in the middle of it all. But first, Nick, I want to check in with you on something even more important. How are your travel arrangements, your accommodations, your creature comforts? I saw you were tweeting pictures of sandwiches. How is it out there in Indy?
It's cool out here. We have a few there's a few staples you have to do every combine. One, I personally, every time I go to the state of Indiana, whether it's for a Colts game, whether I'm just driving through, pork tenderloin sandwiches, it is the staple of the state. You got to get one. It's the first thing I got yesterday. It was great. And then there's the St. Elmo's cocktail. If you're from Indianapolis, if you've been in Indianapolis, you know how strong this is, man. They lather that thing with horseradish. It clears your sinuses out in a way I haven't really ever experienced. I did that today as well. I'll be hitting St. Elmo's later. I'll probably be going to a Pacers game at some point this week, do some NBA stuff. Don't have any NBA in Pittsburgh, obviously, so that'll be cool. Of course, we'll be talking with prospects. But Indianapolis is a really cool city. I love how walkable it is. It's really cool. And, uh, just about 5.5 hours to get here. Me, Joe Herman, and Max Ralph are Penn State guys, and a great photographer, Joe. But it's always cool being out here in Indianapolis. There's a few staples you got to hit no matter what.
Well, it sounds like you're having a lot more fun there than you did last week visiting Harrisburg and for all the staff meetings. So that it sounds, I'm jealous. Let's put it that way. We're jealous here in Harrisburg of you guys out there. And say hi to the guys for me.
Yeah.
But turning to Omar Khan, and you were there and you were reading his body language and, hearing the scuttlebutt from some of the other beat guys about, how do we interpret this? One of the things that caught my ear was the high praise for George Pickens. Pickens, according to Khan, wants to be great, and the Steelers want Pickens to be great in Pittsburgh. And you couple that with other comments that Khan made when talking about the quarterback. In other words, how the quarterback decision really dictates the rest of the offensive roster. You know what I mean? Reading between the lines, and maybe I'm connecting too many dots, but the thing that when you couple both of those comments, it sounds like they want a quarterback that's going to satisfy George Pickens. What does that mean? Or am I off base?
I mean, I don't think it's entirely off base, but I do think. Listen, we talk about George Pickens on here a lot, and what I kind of think is going to happen is they're not going to extend him. I do think that they're going to try and keep him. I don't think they're going to trade him. Doesn't make much sense. I haven't heard anything here. I've already been talking with some people, even though I've only been here a day, and I certainly haven't heard murmurs of a trade being executed there, and continues to kind of bubble up as, okay, the Steelers want George Pickens to be what he could be, which is a true number one. We know he has the potential. The talent's never going to be an issue with number 14 in the black and gold. He's got so much talent. And so what I think they're looking for is they're going to look for that maturity. They're going to look for that growth on and off the football field. They're going to look for him to kind of take initiative, is what I would say, in his own growth, in his own personal growth. And so that's going to be something to look at. But again, I don't think they're going to extend him this year. Now, what I do think is interesting is you mentioned those comments about quarterback dictating the receiver they go after. We've heard them connected to Cooper Kupp, Deebo Samuel, Christian Kirk, Devontae Adams, Brandon Ayuk, all these names over the past year, Darius Slade, Cortland Sutton, you name it, they've been interested in everybody. But I think something that people don't necessarily know or have kind of dug down into is if you get Russell Wilson back, for example, you're going to want another jump ball guy, right? You're going to want a different vertical threat. That might lead you more towards a Darius Slade or trying to get a Cortland Sutton. It would take you more towards a deep threat. If you want Justin Fields can air it out, but Justin Fields is a guy that very often has worked quick game. And so you might want somebody like a Deebo Samuel, who's a yak focused guy, or a chain mover out of the slot, like a Cooper Kupp. And so all these different things kind of line up, right? It's who do you want for each quarterback? And so that is what I think he's kind of relaying there is whoever you have a quarterback, and even if you go outside those options, right? If you have Matthew Stafford, for example, who I don't really think there's a lot there, but if you added Matthew Stafford, Kupp would immediately become one of the top options just because that is a connection. I mean, if you added Aaron Rodgers, it would be different. If you added Daniel Jones, it would be different. You added Sam Darnold, it would be different. All of these things would be different. Quarterbacks are different. Quarterbacks are different in how they kind of relay their body language, how they relay the way they throw the football. And so all that matches up. So the personnel follows what that quarterback wants, what that quarterback excels at, what the vision of the offense is. And so the Steelers, in my opinion, what they need to do is they need to have a vision of their offense and say, if it's a Justin Fields offense, we want this at receiver and running back. If it's a offense for a guy like Russell Wilson, it's a different offense, right? It's a moon ball, deep throwing, check down type offense. It's a different type of offense. So they're different offenses, and the kind of strengths of both guys are different. And so that's going to be the key. So I think that's what he's talking about there. And listen, they're going to add playmakers. I think running back and wide receiver. I think they're going to add at least one running back. I think they're going to add at least two, maybe three wide receivers. They're going to really drill down there. I thought the other kind of interesting quote when it relates to wide receiver, John, was, he was asked about kind of how much of a priority is it, especially considering last year. We talked about the Brandon Ayuk situation for weeks here, right? And then they miss on him, and they were kind of left for dust. They didn't really have anyone there. And he didn't straight out, admit that he messed up, but he kind of hinted there that, it was kind of an all-in strategy at some point, and they kind of paid the price for it. They just straight up weren't good enough at wide receiver. So I don't think they're going to let that happen again this year. I don't know if it's going to be the first move in free agency, but I think within the first week of free agency, we are going to find out a big move the Steelers are going to make a wide receiver. So keep an eye out for that. I think wide receiver is just going to be a huge part of this plan. The quarterback has to come first. Once they sign their quarterback, the next domino can fall then.
Okay. And the interesting thing that Khan said about the quarterbacks, he almost spoke of Justin Fields and Russell Wilson as equals, as toss-ups, one or the other. But if the Steelers really are trying to get this vision of their offense and plan for this offense, these are two different quarterbacks to be planning for. Do you really believe they're not favoring one or the other? Was that just for public consumption? What do you read about where we are with that quarterback quest that the Steelers are on, where right now we don't know who it's going to be?
Well, I've told you I think that both guys have options. I don't think that the door is closed on either one of those players. I have also said, especially last week, I said they're leaning towards Justin Fields. I think that's ideally where things kind of line up. It would be Justin Fields on a 2-year deal, a modest 2-year deal, not one that breaks the bank. But does he want to, test the market? Does Russell Wilson want to test the market, right? The Steelers want this done before free agency. Before March 12th, but ideally before March 10th. Because March 10th is the legal tampering period where you could start to talk to free agents, right? So really, between now and March 10th, they want this done. And so I think it's whichever one is just trending in that right direction. I think, the Steelers like the idea of having Justin Fields. He's young. He has upside, right? He has that kind of selling point to him. But Russ also has a formula that they won with.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that he, fell off at the end of the year. But listen, they've worked with him before. They kind of know how to work with Russ. And so it really comes down to what asks are coming about, what the salary ask is. Another thing to consider, agents are here, right? They're going to hear about, so for example, Justin Fields' agent and Russell Wilson's agent are going to hear probably murmurs of which teams are going to be interested in their clients. And, when you are Omar Khan there, you don't want to speak to me as if Justin Fields is the front runner or Russell Wilson is the front runner. Gives them leverage. If you want the best contract possible, you want to maintain the other as a really serious option. And so you're weighing kind of the gamesmanship of a contract negotiation. Because remember, they're in negotiations with both of these guys, right? They're talking with Justin Fields' representatives, talking with Russell Wilson's representatives. So both of these guys they are talking to. I mean, so all of that weighs in with each other. But I do think they're leaning Justin right now. But there are so many factors. Does he want to test the market? Who is interested in him, and how intrigued is he by those teams? Same with Russ, right? They go both ways. I think, if you're managing the situation, it's just going to be, can you have this wrapped up before free agency begins? Because, as I mentioned, not only is that wide receiver move going to be kind of informed by what you do in free agency with the quarterbacks, but so will defensive line. How much budget do you have to go at corner? If you want to make another supplemental move in another position, where's the money going to be at, right? So signing Russell Wilson or Justin Fields informs you of the cap space you have. Not only does it inform you of the cap space you have, if you have to sign one of these guys to a richer deal than you originally thought, do you have to cut somebody maybe you weren't going to cut, et cetera, right? That could have the decisions for guys like Larry Ogunjobi, Cordero Patterson, Cole Holcomb. That could affect all of that. So when I'm talking about this quarterback situation literally affecting everything, it affects everything for this team.
Right. And again, he laid down the marker, and certainly you laid down the marker. He wants this done by the 12th, if not sooner. So that could be the first big shoe to drop. The other comment that sort of rang in my ears, talking about the talent that's out there and it's going to be on display in the combine and available in the draft. Wide receiver wasn't one of the positions where he thinks there's a lot of depth, he being Khan. And of course, you're just sized up the wide receiver free agency market where you expect the Steelers to make a big splash and correct, the situation last year. But is there any possibility that the lack of depth at wide receiver pushes the Steelers up to do something in the first round with the receiver as well, and even double down on the position that they were caught short on last year?
Oh, certainly. There's no doubt about it. Because he did speak of that from a depth perspective, right? He talked about the deep positions being D-line, DB, running back, O-line, edge. So those 5 positions, and I mean, it's hard to disagree. I think those 5 positions have some degree of depth to them. And we talked about receiver being shallow, right? There is a top to this receiver class. And the top kind of coalesces around those 4 guys, Tedero McMillan, Luther Burden, Emeka Egbuka, and Matthew Gold. And it kind of really comes around that 20th mark. So the Steelers are kind of in that sweet spot where it's not a reach to take any of those 3 guys. I don't think McMillan's going to get to them, so I kind of throw him off to the side. He'll be a top 15 pick. But those other 3 are kind of perfectly put in that 20th, 25, 30 spots, right? That 20 to 30 range. And so, yeah, it definitely fits what the Steelers want to do. They're all 3 different types of players. I think that's a cool thing for the Steelers is they can look at Burden and have a slot Z that's super explosive after the catch. You have Egbuka, who's kind of a field stretcher out of the slot Z. He's a really good blocker. There's Golden, who's probably a truer outside guy. So you have 3 different archetypes too. But as you get deeper into the draft, there's just not difference makers. There's not that 3rd round guy you pound the table for, right? And so, I look back at the day 2 guys they've drafted, like Roman Wilson and Calvin Austin III. I don't know that there's a Calvin Austin III. They drafted him in the 4th round. I'm not sure, there's a guy that I can definitely tell you is going to be there in the 4th round for them to get. The 3rd round, there's guys that are intriguing, but are they day 1 contributors, right? I think all of that kind of brings up the questions of where do you look at with wide receiver. And so I do think free agency, and then I think the 1st round is definitely possible. But I also thought, when you listen to Omar Khan speak today about the defensive line, I thought that was equally as indicative of what they might do there. Talking about how they weren't good enough, how it's important to replenish the O-line. I was just standing there for Howie Roseman's press conference about an hour ago, and he said that the Eagles can never have enough O-line or D linemen. And we know Andy Weidel is the Steelers' assistant general manager, and he has a very similar kind of thought process to Howie Roseman in that regard. And the Steelers seem to love this defensive line class. I thought it was real interesting that Omar Khan even mentioned a free agency market for defensive linemen. There's a few guys in there: Milton Williams, Tershawn Wharton, Osa Odigizua, potentially Javon Hargrave, former Steeler as well. So maybe they make a move there. But keep an eye on that. I think we talked about after the Senior Bowl, defensive line or wide receiver. I think comments today kind of reinforce those two positions being the focus in round 1 of 21.
Yeah, and I don't think you go wrong with either pick, but all things being equal, if one of those key guys at receivers fall to you at 20, it will be hard not to take that person. And then you have a 1-2 punch, a free agency move, a splash there, and then a first round pick at receiver. And then you have Pickens as well in a make or break year where Tomlin is going to have to work wonders with his coaching to get the most out of George as well. That could be very, very interesting indeed. Yeah, I thought he was very stark on the defense because one of your colleagues, I forget the name, pointed out how, this is the highest paid defense 4 years running. Are we getting our money's worth? Basically, he said clearly we're not. And then, basically we're not good enough at D-line. That was pretty stark. But as you've said, the depth there is just unbelievable, and you could address that, even double up on that, and still get a top guy at receiver. You know what I mean? So that'll be interesting to see. The other position that I want you to address, and a lot of clarity there. They expect Jaylen Warren back. They're going to tender him. Najee Harris, the door is open, but Khan couldn't help himself by talking about how great the running back class is in this draft. So it seems like Najee, if they can't get him at the right price, he's gone, and they're gonna draft a running back. What's your take on that running back situation?
Yeah, exactly what we thought, right? Running back, it's such a deep draft at running back. They are going to be in a spot where I kind of thought of through some scenarios at running back. We talked about Najee Harris, and if you're Najee Harris, why aren't you hitting the open market? You look at some of the deals that have happened in recent years, and I look at Ramondre Stevenson and James Conner, those two deals, averaging about 9 per year. If I'm Najee Harris, I'm not taking anything less than 9 per year. Now, maybe you get less than 9 per year because the market's not there in the open market. But why does Najee Harris not test the open market? There's probably going to be teams that are going to be interested in him. Teams like the Raiders, teams like the Bears, maybe. There are just a few teams that make sense for a guy like Najee. So he's going to test the open market. Now, maybe he comes back to the Steelers if his market's just depressed, right? It's not a great market because of the running back class. Maybe teams just want to go into the running back group and draft somebody from that class. But I do think there's going to be a team that looks at his durability, looks at his dependability, looks at his pass pro ability. I think he's got some untapped receiving upside that they haven't tapped into since his rookie year, just because Jaylen Warren has been such a force on third downs and obvious passing situations for them. So I do think Najee Harris is going to have a market. And so I just don't think the Steelers are going to pay that much money for a running back when this running back class is so good. And, when I was talking kind of through some scenarios with some people, you look at the running back class, right? There have been some interesting mock drafts that have given the Steelers guys like Ashton Jeanty and Omarion Hampton at 21. I don't see that happening, but I do think if you get to the back end at 52 and you have a guy like Caleb Johnson there, a guy like Travion Henderson there, it's an interesting kind of thought, because I do think when you heard Omar Khan speak today, the one thing outside of the defensive line that I really took away was he said, simply put, we need playmakers. We're going to go get playmakers, and we need to add playmakers. I mean, listen, running back, receiver are the two obvious positions to add those at. I think they feel like they have two tight ends they can really trust in Pat Freiermuth and Darnell Washington. And so I look at running back. I think they like Jaylen Warren. I look at receiver. I think they like George Pickens, but I think they need 2 or 3 guys on wide receiver. And I've been banging the drum. I think they need a zone running focused back in the backfield. Whether that's Johnson, whether that's a more explosive guy later, like a Jaden Blue, a Bashal Tootin, a Jarquez Hunter. That's kind of where I come in on running back. And so I think round 3 or 4 is probably likely for running back. But I'm kind of coming around to this idea. Maybe there's a scenario where a guy falls to 52 and they end up grabbing a difference maker at running back just because I don't think they're in a position right now where they can turn away talented football players at skill positions. And because they put so much into the offensive line in recent years, drafting 2 first-round tackles, drafting Zach Frazier, Mason McCormick, signing Isaac Sayamalo, I think that they are kind of in a position, when you look at it, they are kind of set up to be able to take a supplemental piece, like a running back in a round 2 scenario, especially if it's a guy like Caleb Johnson or a guy like Travion Henderson. So I do think that's an interesting scenario for them. But I do think when you look at it, they're going to draft a mid-round running back more than likely. That guy's going to pair with Jaylen Warren, and I think they're going to look for a more explosive backfield rather than just a volume-based backfield. One of the things that I have heard consistently from people inside the Steelers organization this offseason is becoming efficient on the ground. They were a volume-based offense this year. They had one of the worst yards per carry in the NFL. They had one of the worst rushing success rates in the NFL. In terms of volume numbers, they were fine because they ran it so often. But if you're going to run the ball as often as they do, you have to be explosive. You have to be efficient because they're going to have limitations at quarterback, maybe a limitation at wide receiver. And so you look at that and you say, you got to get explosive at running back. You have to add something there because they feel like this offensive line with Broderick Jones switching to left tackle, Troy Falconer's going to be back. They're going to kind of coalesce and be able to take a step forward. So keep an eye on that. I think explosiveness, chunk plays on the ground are going to be a big focus of this because they need to be efficient on the ground if they want to be a good offense.
I love that term, volume-based offense. I think that's a synonym for driving Yinzers crazy because that offensive at times was like watching paint dry. It was infuriating. It was going nowhere. If you want a volume-based offense, I guess is a way to make it sound good. Is this where we get the fingerprints of Arthur Smith at the running back position? Do you think he's going to have a big say, in that? And will he have a say at the wide receiver and the quarterback as well in terms of who's ultimately signed? Because the other thing Khan said, all options are on the table at quarterback too, but obviously he did say he would like to sign one or the other, Fields or Wilson. So, yeah, what is Arthur's? Talk about his role and his fingerprints and where we can see his fingerprints on how this offense is being built for 2025.
There's no doubt about it. I mean, the entire reason they declined Najee Harris's option, if you remember the opening day of training camp on move-in day, Najee Harris was asked why they declined his sixth option, and the reason he was told was scheme fit. I think we saw throughout the season he was not a great scheme fit for the outside zone, wide zone focus of Arthur Smith's offense. And so I think that's a big part of it. And that's why I talk about zone runner as the archetype they're going to look at. It doesn't necessarily have to be speed. It could be a speedy guy at running back. But, Caleb Johnson has solid speed. He's not a burner. He's not a Bashal Tootin or Jaden Blue, who are probably going to run 4.35, 4.3. That is a big part of this. They need to have a guy that fits Arthur Smith's scheme. Jaylen Warren, I think the further along you kind of went with Jaylen Warren, you just kind of saw the natural marriage between Arthur Smith and Jaylen Warren's games, right? It fit more. He's explosive in short areas. When he makes the one cut, he gets upfield and explodes out of that. He's naturally good in the leak out game and the check down game. He's good as a screen producer in space. All these things really fit Jaylen Warren really well. And the occasional gap stuff that you see from him, he does really well too. He's a multi-schematic back. I think that's what fits Jaylen Warren really well. Najee Harris is very, in my opinion, fit on gap runs and inside zone. Steelers do run some inside zone. They run some gap, but they run way too much toss stuff, way too much outside zone, way too many things that require that short area burst and explosiveness. That is just not Najee Harris's game. If Najee Harris goes to a downhill rushing attack that is physical, that's a good fit for him. But Arthur Smith's scheme is going to fit this running back much better. And at wide receiver, we kind of did see a little bit of that, right? The blocking, the effort that you need at wide receiver. I think we saw that in a little bit of a way with Ben Skowronek. When he came in and was kind of that wing player, that insert blocker, you're going to want probably a guy that gets after it and blocks. Or you're going to want a guy that produces after the catch. That's another thing that you look at. Arthur Smith's scheme has kind of evolved in a few ways. The type of receivers he likes are these kind of big physical guys on the outside, right? Or these slot speedsters. So a guy like Calvin Austin fits so well with that. He fits the Khalif Raymond role where he's just a slot guy that stretches the field and wins vertically. Fits perfectly. George Pickens, this big physical outside guy. But there are two archetypes they don't really have in the offense. They don't have that second big physical outside guy. Think of a Corey Davis, if you will, in that regard. And they don't have this yak guy that can take a screen. Most of that offense went through Jalen Warren or went through Najee Harris. The screen game went through there. They kind of tried to make Cordero Patterson that, but really weren't able to completely marry the two together. And so all of that comes together for me and say, yes, this is where the schematics are going to fit the personnel. This is going to be the offensive system kind of dictating that.
Speaking of that yards after catch guy, a guy that didn't get out of the starting gate in 2024 was Roman Wilson. I did hear that Khan gave him a nice shout out. He gave him a Tomlinism. The arrow is up. Could this be a guy who we hear a lot more from in the offense in 2025 and finds a role, in that Arthur Smith construct?
Yeah, listen, I think the Steelers always like Roman Wilson. I think they still like Roman Wilson. So absolutely. That's why I've always talked about, their additions probably are going to be outside receivers, right? Or at least guys that are outside capable, just because in the slot, they at least have Calvin Austin and Roman Wilson. Roman Wilson is a fun player to fit in the Arthur Smith offense. He is a speedy dot. That's what I would describe him as. When he hits the gas, he gets to kind of 100, right? He goes from 0 to 100 immediately. That is his superpower. He just hits full acceleration right away. And so it's hard for guys to kind of keep up with his speed across the field. He's a horizontal field stretcher. He's kind of the opposite of Calvin Austin. Calvin Austin is this vertical field stretcher that wins down the field. Mm-hmm. Roman Wilson wins on crossers, wins on drag routes, wins on over routes. He is a horizontal field stretcher. And so they didn't really have that last year outside of George Pickens, occasionally hitting the big play there. And so that is a part of his game, I think, that fits in really well. It'll probably open up their play action game a little more. I really like his fit in that. He's a competitive blocker. Now, he's a little undersized, but he's not going to be an elite blocker. But, man, he tries. He works his butt off. And so, yeah, I do think he has a role here, and he's going to have kind of a chance to prove himself there because he does bring something to the room that I don't think anyone else has, which is that horizontal stretching ability out of the slot.
Okay. Yeah, that will be nice to see that piece of the puzzle finally fit into the offense because it was kind of a disappointment not really seeing him at all on the field in last season. We want you to give us a little preview for what's ahead at the Combine, and we're going to have a special edition of the podcast on Thursday because there's going to be so much news that you're going to be gathering there. But just give us a little bit on the plan as you see it developing with Khan for the secondary, specifically the cornerback situation. Is that going to be another free agency splash, or how does the draft look at that position? Because usually if you don't want to get a high one, you don't get a lot of return at that position. What's your thoughts?
I mean, I think it's a pretty good corner class. Now, you look at slot specific guys, I think it's a little deeper in the slot area rather than outside guys. There's both at both spots. But this is a really unusually good free agent group at corner. It is a really good corner group, both in the slot and outside guys. And I think, Omar Khan acknowledged that to a degree today. He also acknowledged that Corey Trice, as much as they like him, his durability is an issue, right? The torn ACL in year one, the hamstring injury just wiping out so much of his second year, too. Like, it's a concern. Corey Trice has yet to prove he can stay on the football field, even if he's very talented. I think they like him as a player. But, they bench Beanie Bishop for Cam Sutton, right? I think it speaks to their thoughts on those young guys. Even if they're promising and the Steelers like them, it's not going to prevent them from upgrading. And so I do think you look at corner as a free agency heavy spot for them. They might sign two of them. They might sign a slot in and outside guy. I don't think you completely want to shut off the ability for a Corey Trice or a Beanie Bishop to take a step and step in. But I also think you look at corner and say, this is a unusually deep group in free agency at both positions, slot and outside corner. They've been patchworking this position for years, right? How long has it been them signing guys like Patrick Peterson, signing guys like Levi Wallace, trading for Dante Jackson, before they can just sit down and say, we're going to get long-term answers at this position? And I think free agency this year gives them an opportunity to get guys in the prime of their careers that fit their scheme. And so I do think corner is going to be a big part of the free agency plan. And I wouldn't be surprised if we're talking about draft time as that is not a significant need for them because they've signed two guys.
And now, sort of previewing the combine that's going to be unfolding late this week and over the weekend. How do you, as a Steelers beat reporter, work the combine? I mean, are you out there with your stopwatch time and fees? I mean, what type of information are you looking to gather, and how does it inform your coverage as you move into free agency and the draft related to all things Steelers?
I mean, being on the ground itself, the numbers on the football field mean the least. Now, they mean something. Athletic thresholds, measurements mean something. The Steelers themselves absolutely love freak athletes, so that matters a lot. But when you look at what actually matters a lot this week, medicals, character interviews, things like that, I think that's a big part of it. So, no, I'm not going to be in Lucas Oil with my stopwatch on. I'm going to be, talking with teams and league sources and, anyone from the Steelers you can catch up with and ask about this guy. Does he have a medical issue, right? Because sometimes you pop up with medical issues and maybe it's not reported out there. Sometimes you find out guys have character concerns that you didn't know. If you get glowing reviews on guys, I think that's a big part of it. So you kind of have to work the behind the scenes part of this. And the combine is where a lot of different things happen. It's not just where draft occurs. You're looking at the prospects, you're learning about them, but it's also where agents meet with GMs, meet with assistant general managers, meet with the front offices. And so you're kind of getting a feel. Who are the Steelers' targets going to be in free agency, on the trade market? What is smoke and what is legit? It's way easier to kind of understand what is legit and what is just hogwash in person. When you are kind of in I don't know if I would call it a lab, but it kind of is. It's a lab of football, if you will. And you're just talking with these people all week. You're just getting so much information into your brain. And you're kind of taking that and informing yourself before free agency and then for the draft. And that's kind of what matters to me as a beat writer. And then you can obviously pay attention to testing numbers, thresholds things will meet, et cetera, et cetera. But a lot of the other stuff around the testing is what you really focus on.
All right. Well, I'll tell you, you're going to be on the ground for the next couple of days, and then we're going to reconvene right back here late Thursday afternoon, and we're going to pick your brain for some of those tidbits that you're picking up from this plethora of sources all under one roof, this football laboratory where we hope that Omar Khan and company are putting the formula together for a winning roster in 2025. So be back here on Thursday, guys. And until then, go Steelers, get those playmakers.